Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I always hated working the night shift. Something about the dead hours between midnight and dawn made the world feel off. The diner sat at the edge of town, perched along a lonely stretch of highway where headlights rarely passed. It was the kind of place truckers stopped when they had nowhere else to go, and drifters used as a temporary escape from the cold. The neon sign hummed outside, flickering like a heartbeat, casting a dull red glow over the empty parking lot. It was a slow night, the kind where time stretched and distorted, where minutes felt like hours and every little sound, the buzzing light, the faint hum of the fridge, the occasional groan of the wind outside, felt amplified. I leaned against the counter, absently wiping down a spotless coffee mug just to keep my hands busy. My coworker, Benny, had gone out back for a smoke break, leaving me alone with the radio's quiet drone. The clock read 2:47 a.m. That's when I noticed him. He sat in the farthest booth, by the window. I didn't hear the bell above the door chime, didn't see him walk in, but there he was, motionless, watching. The diner's dim light cast long shadows over his face, obscuring most of his features, but I could tell he was old. His skin was pale, almost gray, and deep wrinkles folded over his knuckles where his hands rested flat on the table. He didn't have a menu, didn't have a coffee in front of him, just sat there, silent, staring at nothing. A chill crawled down my spine. I tried to shake it off. Get a grip, it's just another late-night regular. I cleared my throat, grabbing my notepad as I walked toward him. "Evening, can I get you something?" No response. His eyes didn't even flicker toward me. He sat stiff, barely breathing, like a mannequin dressed in an old black suit. A faint smell clung to him, stale, like mothballs and dust. The scent of something long forgotten. I tried again. "Sir, you doing okay?" Still nothing. Unease coiled in my gut, but I forced a polite smile. Maybe he was hard of hearing, maybe just lost in thought. I was about to walk away when his fingers twitched ever so slightly. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "Do you know what time it is?" Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. The words were deliberate, slow, each syllable dragged like a dull knife across skin. I swallowed. Just past 2:50. He didn't react. For a long, horrible moment, we just stood there. Me gripping my notepad so tightly my knuckles ached, and him sitting still as death. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird old guy passing through, maybe a little senile. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. The booth was empty. I spun back around, heart hammering in my chest, but he was still there, seated exactly as before, as if he hadn't moved. And yet, in the reflection, the booth held nothing but shadows. The air in the diner felt suddenly wrong, heavy, thick. A pressure built behind my ribs, like the room itself was closing in. The bell above the door rang, breaking the silence. Benny strolled back in, rubbing his arms against the cold. "Damn, it's freezing out there." He shook the rain from his jacket, glancing at me. "You good? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, shaky and brittle. "Yeah, just weird customer." I jerked my thumb toward the booth. But when I turned back, the man was gone. The seat was empty, no coffee cup, no lingering warmth where a body had been. Just a dry, mothball-scented presence that made my skin prickle. Benny frowned. "What customer?" I felt my stomach drop. The guy who was just sitting there. "There hasn't been anyone in here all night, dude." I opened my mouth to argue, to insist I had seen him, spoken to him, but the words withered in my throat. I felt cold, and then I noticed something else. The clock above the counter still read 2:47 a.m. It hadn't moved. A thick silence settled between us. Benny frowned up at the clock, then at me, then back again. That's weird, right? I couldn't answer. My thoughts were scrambling, clawing for something logical, something normal to ground me. The air smelled different, like old books and damp fabric. Then, somewhere behind me, in a voice as soft as the grave, I heard it again. "You know what time it is?" My blood turned to ice. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The last customer had never left. I gripped the counter so hard my nails dug into the worn formica. Benny's face shifted, a frown settling between his brows as he glanced around, uneasy. He must have heard it too. The diner, once just another mundane, greasy little stop on the highway, now felt wrong. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to steady. This isn't happening. The radio crackled. A low hum, distorted static, like something trying to push through the signal. The fluorescent light above the counter flickered, buzzing in an erratic rhythm. Benny muttered a curse, glancing toward the clock. His fingers twitched, tapping against his arm as if waiting for time to move. It didn't. 2:47 a.m. Still, unchanging. The temperature in the diner had dropped, not in the way it does when someone opens the door, but deeper, like the very warmth was being drained from the room. Benny shifted. His voice, usually brimming with sarcasm, was small. "Dude, are we—" A sound cut him off. Not a voice. Not static. A slow, deliberate creak, like the weight of something pressing against the floorboards. Right behind me. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My breath came shallow, my skin crawling with the electric charge of something unseen. Benny's face drained of color, his eyes locked on something over my shoulder. I swallowed. "Benny!" His mouth opened, then closed, his Adam's apple bobbed. And then, in a motion too fast to be natural, his eyes snapped to the booth. Empty. I forced myself to turn. The diner looked the same as before. Beaten vinyl booths, dull counter stools, the faint reflection of neon against the windows. But something was missing. Or maybe something had never been there to begin with. My voice came out hoarse. "We need to get out of here." Benny barely nodded before a sharp, grating screech cut through the diner. The clock. The hands had begun moving again, but backward. The second hand jerked, resisting some unseen force, fighting against the flow of time itself. It ticked, then stalled, ticked again, then slid in reverse. 2:46 a.m. The world seemed to breathe around us, stretching and distorting. My head spun, my stomach twisted in knots. The very air of the diner felt pulled thin, stretched beyond what it should be. The static on the radio rose to a high-pitched whine, and then... click. Silence. The radio died. The fluorescent lights buzzed once, then blinked out, plunging the diner into darkness except for the weak, sputtering glow of the neon sign outside. Benny cursed under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" A shadow shifted near the booth. Not a trick of the light. Something moved. I grabbed Benny's wrist, gripping so tight my fingers burned. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The neon's faint red glow outlined a shape, something that shouldn't be there. It was him, seated exactly as before, hands resting on the table, motionless. But this time his head was turned toward us. Watching, his lips curled into something that was almost a smile. I stopped breathing. The radio crackled. And then, in that same slow, deliberate whisper, he spoke. "Do you know what time it is?" The words coiled around me, slipping under my skin, into my bones. Benny was rigid beside me, his pulse a frantic rhythm against my grip. I swallowed, forcing my voice to work, forcing myself to say something, anything. It's almost 3. The smile stretched wider. Too wide. His teeth were too straight, too uniform, like they had been placed there instead of grown. The air around him blurred, warped, like heat rising from asphalt. 2:45 a.m. The hands on the clock continued to turn in reverse. Time was unraveling. My breath came short and fast, my throat dry as sandpaper. I had to move. We had to go. But Benny wasn't moving. His eyes were locked on the figure, his lips parted in silent terror. Then, in a jerky, mechanical motion, his head twitched. Once, twice, before he whispered, "I think I remember him." The diner lurched. Not the ground, not the walls, but something beneath the surface of the world itself, like reality had hiccuped, like the very fabric of existence had tilted. And then Benny let go of my hand and started walking toward the booth. Benny took a step forward. His movements were slow, dreamlike, as if he wasn't fully in control of his body. His eyes were wide but unfocused, his breath shallow. "Benny, stop." My voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of it felt wrong in the stillness of the diner. He didn't stop. Another step. The figure in the booth remained unmoving, his face still locked in that too-wide grin. The shadows around him twisted, pulsing in a way that made my stomach churn. He wasn't just sitting there anymore. He was waiting. I reached out, grabbing Benny's arm with every ounce of strength I had left. "Benny, we have to go." His body stiffened under my grip. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a deep trance, his expression shifting from blank detachment to sudden, overwhelming fear. The second he turned back toward me, the diner shifted again. A deep, gut-wrenching pull, like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The clock above the counter jerked violently. The second hand snapped backward, ticking in rapid, erratic movements. 2:44 a.m. The man in the booth inhaled. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of something old, something tired, waking up. Then he moved. Not like a person. His body didn't shift. He didn't rise, didn't stand. He just wasn't in the booth anymore. He was closer, too close. Right beside me. A smell filled my nostrils. Dust, decay, the faint scent of something rotting in a forgotten place. Benny gasped, yanking his arm from my grip, stumbling backward. The neon light outside flickered, and for a split second, I saw him. The customer. His skin was stretched too thin, his grin splitting his face apart, revealing teeth upon teeth upon teeth. His eyes, dark pits, bore into me, the kind of gaze that knew me, that had always known me. "Do you know what time it is?" The words slithered past me, curling in my ears, pressing into my skull. 2:43 a.m. The walls of the diner groaned. The air warped. The second hand on the clock snapped off, spinning violently before falling into the void of its face. We weren't supposed to be here. We weren't supposed to see him. Something deep inside me screamed, "Run." I grabbed Benny's wrist, yanking him so hard we nearly crashed into the counter. His feet fumbled beneath him, but I didn't stop. I shoved through the diner door, the bell's cheerful chime ringing in my ears as we stumbled into the night. The parking lot was empty. No cars, no signs of life, just the vast, dark stretch of highway that disappeared into nothing. Benny was gasping beside me, bent over, hands on his knees. I turned back to the diner and froze. The inside was dark. Not empty, not abandoned, just gone. No flickering neon, no buzzing lights, just a hollow, black void where the diner should have been. I took a shaky step forward, my breath fogging in the cold air. And then the sign above flickered. The diner snapped back into existence. Just like that. The lights were on again, the counter was clean, the booths were empty, the radio was playing some old tune from decades past. And the clock on the wall read 3:0 a.m. Time had moved forward. Benny straightened beside me, still panting. He was pale, his face glistening with sweat. What the hell was that? I shook my head, swallowing hard. I had no answer. The diner looked normal. It was as if nothing had happened. But as I turned back toward the road, one last thing caught my eye. The booth, the one at the very back. A single coffee cup sat there now, steaming as if it had just been poured. And beside it, a watch. Old. Silver. the glass cracked. And its hands? Still, frozen at 2:47 a.m. I didn't touch it. I didn't go back inside. I just walked away, Benny right beside me, neither of us daring to speak. Because we both knew the truth. The last customer had never left, and he never would. I don't even know how to start this, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm just losing my mind. I don't know anymore. This happened 2 years ago, and to this day I haven't been able to go camping again. The thought of it makes my stomach twist. So, for context, I've always loved the outdoors. Grew up hiking, camping, doing all that solo survivalist crap that made me feel like some kind of badass. I knew how to handle myself in the woods, how to navigate, how to listen to the sounds of nature and know when something wasn't right. That last part? I wish I had listened to it sooner. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, me and 3 buddies, just a chill guys getaway deep in the mountains. We picked a spot about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, somewhere totally off-grid. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. The first night was perfect. We drank, we laughed, we told dumb horror stories around the fire, the usual. Around 2 a.m. we all finally crashed in our tents. Nothing weird. The second night, though, that's when everything changed. It started subtle. Around midnight, I was sitting by the fire alone, just staring into the flames while the others were already in their tents. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know what I mean. The kind of silence that presses in, where even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not wind through the trees. An actual voice. Faint, distant, but there. I froze, my skin prickling. It came from beyond the firelight, out in the trees. Too far to make out words, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. At first I thought maybe one of my friends had gotten up to take a piss and was messing with me. But then I heard another one. A second whisper, layered under the first, coming from the opposite direction. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Wind. Just the wind. Then it moved. The whispering shifted, circling us. One moment it was near the trees behind me, the next it was coming from the right, then the left. Always just outside the fire's glow. I leaned forward, straining to hear, but the words were just out of reach, like a conversation you're not meant to be a part of. Then I laughed. Low, breathless, way too close. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing. Just the same unmoving forest. The same tall pines, their black silhouettes swaying against the star-dotted sky. I told myself it was my imagination, sleep deprivation, paranoia, the way fire messes with your senses in the dark. So, like an idiot, I convinced myself to ignore it. I put out the fire and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to close my eyes. That was mistake number 1. I don't know how long I laid there, but at some point I drifted off. And then, in the dead of night, something woke me up. A whisper, outside my tent. I stopped breathing. It was so quiet, so deliberate, like someone was crouched, inches from the fabric, speaking directly to me. I couldn't make out the words, but it was low, raspy, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't used to speaking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to move. But I just lay there, my muscles locked up, my mind refusing to process what was happening. Then, slowly the whispering moved, circling the tent. It was multiple voices now, soft, murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot, just beyond understanding. And then the zipper moved. Not a lot, just a little, a soft, slow tug. I snapped out of my paralysis and lunged for my knife. Silence. The whispering stopped. My breath was the only sound in the tent, coming in short, panicked bursts. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, My friends were already awake, looking just as freaked out as I felt. Before I could even say anything, Mike, the most level-headed guy in our group, spoke first. "You guys heard it too, right?" Turns out I wasn't alone. Each of them had woken up at some point in the night to the whispers. They'd heard the voices circling the camp, moving through the trees. But the worst part? None of us had unzipped our tents. But in the dirt around the campsite there were footprints. Not ours. They were thin, bare, too many, circling each tent. We packed up and got the hell out of there within 10 minutes, leaving most of our gear behind. None of us spoke the entire hike back. I don't know what was out there, I don't know what we heard, what we almost saw, but I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone in those woods, and whatever was out there, it never wanted us to leave. I haven't been camping since. I used to work the late shift at Domino's, delivering pizzas until 2, sometimes 3 in the morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and most nights were uneventful. Drunk college kids, night shift workers, the occasional stoner who forgot they even ordered. It was all pretty routine. Then there was that night. It started like any other. The usual slow trickle of late-night orders, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 1:45 a.m., just as I was thinking about cleaning up and heading home, a last-minute order came in. 1 large pepperoni, paid in cash. The address wasn't far, somewhere on the outskirts of town, near a wooded area where houses were more spread out. I groaned, not thrilled about the idea of driving down an empty road that late, but a tip is a tip. I grabbed the box, hopped in my car, and punched the address into Google Maps. The route took me further away from civilization than I expected. Streetlights became sparse, and the houses were spaced farther apart, swallowed by darkness. I turned onto a narrow, cracked road lined with twisted, overgrown trees, their branches casting jagged shadows under my headlights. The GPS led me to a small, isolated house at the very end of the road. No lights were on. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching against loose gravel. The house looked abandoned. Paint peeling off the siding, a broken porch railing, weeds growing in tangled patches around the steps. I checked the ticket again. Yep, this was the address. I hesitated. Most people waiting for a pizza leave some kind of light on. A porch light, a living room lamp. Something. But this place was pitch black. I grabbed the pizza, stepped out of the car, and made my way up the creaking steps. I knocked twice, the sound too loud in the silence. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I sighed, already picturing some wasted guy passed out on the couch, forgetting he ordered. I reached for my phone to call the number on the receipt when I noticed something. The front door was slightly open. Not a lot, just a crack, barely enough to see into the house. But it had been closed when I got here, I was sure of it. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I should have left. I should have just turned around, gone back to my car, and driven away. But something about the whole situation made me uneasy. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. Darkness. Empty space. A hallway leading deeper into the house. The air smelled stale, like old wood and something slightly sour. No movement, no voices. Then, from somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked. I froze. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Another creak, closer this time. Then, in the dimness of the hallway, a shape moved. I didn't see details, just the faintest shift in the darkness, something tall, lurking just out of view. And then, a voice. "Come inside." Soft, hoarse, Ron. I dropped the pizza. My body finally obeyed, and I turned, bolting down the steps so fast I nearly tripped. My heart hammered as I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling to start the car. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the porch. The door was wide open now. I could see further inside, see more of the hallway, more of the darkness. And standing just beyond the threshold was a man, or at least something shaped like a man. He was too tall, his limbs too long, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He stood there, completely still, just watching me. My hands shook as I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel. As I backed away, the figure stepped forward. One slow, deliberate movement, like he was testing the air. I slammed the gas, peeling away down the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the Domino's parking lot, still shaking as I stumbled inside. My manager took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him everything. The empty house, the open door, the voice. He frowned, grabbing the store phone to call the number on the receipt. Disconnected. Then he checked the address. It didn't exist. The road, the house, nothing was there. The order had never been placed. There was no record of it in the system. I quit that night. I don't deliver anymore. But sometimes, when I'm out late, driving past dark, empty houses, I swear I see a door just slightly open, and a figure standing just beyond it, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every shadow in my room feeling too deep, too dark. My brain replayed the night over and over. The empty house, the door that had been closed, then cracked, then wide open, the voice that didn't sound quite right, and the figure, too tall, too still, watching me. But what bothered me the most wasn't the house, the order, or even the way the address didn't exist. It was the way he moved. Or rather, the way he barely moved at all. The step forward had been slow, measured, like he was waiting for something, like he knew I was watching. I tried telling myself it was a prank, some elaborate trick. But the address wasn't real, the number was disconnected, and I knew, deep in my gut, that I hadn't been meant to leave. The next day I drove back to where the house had been, or where I thought it had been. The cracked road was still there, lined with its twisting trees and jagged shadows, but at the end of the road, where the house had stood, there was nothing. No foundation, no debris, just an overgrown clearing, the weeds waist-high, swaying slightly in the wind, like no house had ever been there. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Had I somehow gone to the wrong place? But I knew that wasn't true. I had parked in this exact spot. I had seen the porch, the peeling paint, the broken railing. I had seen him. A sudden, awful thought slithered into my mind. What if he's still here? I didn't stick around to find out. I left, drove straight home, locked the doors. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, I woke up to a knock at my door. It was 1:45 a.m., the exact time I had delivered that order. I sat up, heart pounding. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. No one came to my door this late. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I checked the peephole. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway, empty as ever. I stood there, listening, barely breathing. A full minute passed, then another. I exhaled shakily, backing away. I told myself it was nothing, just some drunk neighbor knocking on the wrong door. I turned to go back to bed. No, I froze. It was closer this time. Not at the door. At my bedroom window. I spun around, my stomach twisting violently. My apartment was 3 floors up. There was no balcony, no fire escape. There was no way anyone could be outside my window. But I heard it. And then the handle on my front door rattled. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, and backed into the corner of the room, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The doorknob twisted slowly, testing. And then silence. No more knocking, no more rattling, just nothing. For hours I sat there, frozen in fear, waiting for it to come back. I didn't sleep, I didn't move. And when the sun finally rose, spilling weak morning light into my apartment, I finally worked up the courage to check the door. It was still locked, bolted, but something was waiting for me. A single piece of paper had been slipped under the door. I picked it up with numb fingers, unfolding it slowly. There were only 5 words, written in thin, careful letters. I found you this time. I threw up. I called the police, barely able to get the words out. They arrived within minutes, checking the building, searching for any sign of an intruder. They didn't find anything. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving my floor. There was no one in the hall, no one outside my window. They treated me like I was imagining things. I wasn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat up in bed, lights on, every sound making my pulse spike. I checked the door every hour. I checked the windows. Nothing. For 3 nights, nothing happened. No knocks, no notes, no rattling doorknob. And then, the 4th night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. A text message from an unknown number. I hesitated, then opened it. A photo, a picture of me asleep in my bed, taken from inside my apartment. I ran. I didn't grab anything. I just grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and bolted down the hallway. I drove straight to my friend's place across town and stayed there for a week. When I finally went back to my apartment, it felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was still lurking there, waiting for me to come back. But nothing happened. No more texts, no more knocks, nothing. Until last night. I had almost convinced myself it was over, that maybe somehow I had gotten away. Then, just as I was getting into bed, my phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. It was an address. I copied it into Google Maps, heart pounding. It was a police station. My stomach twisted. What the hell was this? Then another text came through. Check the news. I hesitated, then opened my laptop, my hands shaking as I typed. The first headline stopped my heart. Breaking. Man arrested after breaking into apartment. Stalked victim for months. I clicked the article, my vision blurring as I read. The man was caught breaking into someone else's apartment last night. A neighbor had called the cops after hearing strange noises. When they arrested him, he had a knife, a lock-picking kit, and dozens of photographs. Pictures of me, taken over the past year. My blood turned to ice. Another text came through. A single message. I wasn't working alone. I stared at the screen, my pulse a roaring drum in my ears. I typed back, my hands slick with sweat. Who is this? No response. And then, a knock at my door. I didn't move. The knock at my door wasn't loud. It was soft, deliberate. The kind of knock someone does when they know you're home, when they're waiting. I gripped my phone tightly, my fingers slick with sweat, my mind racing. Whoever had been texting me knew things. Whoever had broken into my apartment had been caught. But if he had a partner, someone still out there, who the hell was at my door now? I forced myself to my feet, heart pounding as I stepped toward the peephole. My breath stalled. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Then my phone buzzed again. Another text. Check the camera feed. I hesitated, then slowly opened the security app on my phone. My apartment building had security cameras. One pointed at each hallway, another at the front entrance. I tapped into the hallway feed, and there he was, standing just out of frame. Not in front of my door, just to the side, in the blind spot of the peephole. Waiting? A jagged chill crawled up my spine. I watched as he stood there, motionless, his head tilted slightly toward my door. He knew. He knew I was watching. Then, the sound of police sirens. Faint at first, growing louder. My phone buzzed again. Don't open the door. I didn't. I stepped back, my pulse hammering as I listened to the sirens pull up outside the building. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs. Someone yelled commands. A door slammed open. Then, struggling, shouting. I checked the feed again, my stomach tightening. The man outside my apartment had turned. He was running, but he didn't make it far. 2 officers tackled him to the ground. More shouts, someone yelling, "We got him!" And then, just like that, it was over. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with adrenaline. The next hour was a blur. Cops at my door, questions, reports. They showed me his mugshot. A man in his 40s, hollow eyes, a sick, twisted grin. He had been watching me for months, maybe longer. But that wasn't the worst part. I asked about the first guy, the one they caught breaking into the other apartment. One of the officers shook his head. "We found his body this morning." My blood ran cold. "What?" I whispered. "Dead. Stabbed over a dozen times. Whoever did it, they wanted him gone." I stared at him, my breath coming short. If the first guy was dead, then who the hell had been texting me? Who had warned me? I never found out. The texts stopped. The unknown number was disconnected. The police called it a coincidence. I call it something else. I moved out of state after that. New city, new job, new apartment. Somewhere with no windows facing the street, somewhere where no one knows me. But I still check my phone at night. I still glance at security cameras before opening my door. Because someone out there warned me. Someone out there was watching him too. And I can't help but wonder, what happens when they start watching me again? Photography has never been more than a hobby for me. Some people paint, others play instruments. I take pictures. I like capturing moments that feel empty, frozen in time. Abandoned streets at dawn, forgotten alleyways, train stations just before the last departure of the night. There's something about the stillness that's always pulled me in, like I'm documenting places the world has left behind. I never took pictures of people, not intentionally anyway. I liked my photos to feel untouched, undisturbed, free of human interference. That's why, when I first noticed the man in one of my shots, I barely paid him any mind. It was a picture I had taken near the riverfront, an old cobblestone walkway lined with rusted lampposts. The sky had been a deep shade of navy, the last remnants of daylight barely clinging to the horizon. I had been focused on getting the symmetry right, the way the lampposts cast long, thin shadows stretching toward the water. It wasn't until later, when I was going through my shots, that I noticed the figure standing in the distance. He was near the edge of the frame, half hidden in the gloom beneath a flickering streetlight. A tall man, wearing a hood, his face completely obscured by shadow. His posture was off, rigid, almost unnatural, like he wasn't just passing through but standing there deliberately, watching. I remember staring at the image for a long time, feeling vaguely unsettled but ultimately brushing it off. People ended up in my photos all the time. That's just how it was in a city. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I saw him again. I had spent the day walking through different neighborhoods looking for new angles, fresh places to shoot. That night, as I uploaded the day's shots onto my laptop, something stopped me cold. There he was. Different street, different time of day, same hooded figure standing just out of focus, lingering at the edge of the frame. I felt my stomach tighten. I flipped through the images again, searching, my fingers moving faster. I found another, then another. Every few shoots, there he was. I started combing through my older photos. He was there too. Not always obvious, not always in plain sight, but once I started looking, I couldn't unsee it. Sometimes he was in the background, blending into the crowd. Other times he was more isolated, standing near an alleyway, leaning against a railing, positioned behind a tree just far enough that only half his body was visible. The strangest part, the timeline didn't make sense. The first time I noticed him was weeks ago, but as I dug deeper, I found him in shots from months ago, different seasons, different locations. He had been following me for much longer than I had realized. That night, sleep was out of the question. I sat in my apartment, laptop open, heart pounding as I clicked through years of photos. The earliest one I found was from nearly 2 years ago. I had no explanation. Had he been tracking me all this time? Had I really been that oblivious? I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an odd angle making random passers-by look familiar. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. He was there on purpose. I stopped taking photos for a while. For weeks, my camera collected dust on my desk. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning crowds, checking reflections in windows. But paranoia settled into my bones like an illness. Then, one night, I made a mistake. I went shooting again. I told myself I just needed closure. One last night of photos to prove to myself that he wasn't really there, that my paranoia had gotten the better of me. I stuck to busy streets, well-lit areas, places with cameras and people. I avoided isolated alleyways, stayed away from quiet corners where shadows stretched too far, and for a while, it felt normal. But when I got home and plugged in my camera, there was a photo I didn't take. My breath stalled in my chest. It was blurry, poorly framed, like the lens had been lifted and clicked at random, but the subject was unmistakable. It was me. Not a reflection, not a shadow. A photo taken from behind me, somewhere in the crowd while I had been taking pictures. Someone had been standing inches away from me, and I hadn't even known. Panic spread through me in icy waves. I scanned the photo for details, desperate for any clue, the angle, the location. It had been taken no more than an hour before I got home. Whoever took it had been close enough to reach out and touch me. I called the police that night. I told them everything, the photos, the stranger, the realization that he had been following me for years. An officer came by, took a statement, assured me they would look into it. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't take it seriously. No real crime had been committed. No threats, no evidence beyond my own paranoia. I installed extra locks, kept my curtains shut tight, stopped going out at night, and for a few weeks, nothing happened. Then the envelope arrived. It was slipped under my apartment door while I was sleeping. No return address, no markings, just a plain white envelope containing a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from inside my own apartment. I ran straight to the police station, envelope clutched in my shaking hands. This time they listened. Officers arrived at my apartment within minutes. They checked the locks, dusted for prints, reviewed security footage. And this time they found something. The cameras in my building had caught him. A man in a dark hoodie, waiting outside the entrance at 2:46 a.m. He never entered through the front. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, but in one frame he could be seen slipping into the stairwell behind a tenant, walking straight toward my floor. They arrested him a week later. He had been watching me for over 3 years. He lived just a few blocks away, a man I had never met, never spoken to, never noticed in my daily life. But he had noticed me. The police found hundreds of photos in his apartment. Shots of me walking home, sitting in cafes, standing at crosswalks, flipping through books in stores. Some from months ago, some from years ago, and some from inside my apartment while I was sleeping. They asked if I wanted to see them. I said no. I haven't picked up my camera since. Because I know I wasn't the first person he watched, and I won't be the last. I met Sophie in the spring of 2018, during my final year of university. She wasn't like other people I had dated. There was something different about her, something subtle but noticeable. She carried herself with quiet confidence, never trying too hard to stand out, but somehow always the most intriguing person in the room. She wasn't loud, wasn't overbearing. She didn't demand attention, yet she always seemed to get it. We met at a mutual friend's party, one of those casual house gatherings where people squeeze into small apartments and pretend they aren't bothered by the heat or the smell of cheap beer. Sophie was standing near the window, looking out at the city like she was studying it. Not bored, not disengaged, just watching. I struck up a conversation, expecting small talk, but Sophie didn't do small talk. She asked oddly specific questions, things most people wouldn't think to ask. "What's your earliest memory of being afraid?" she asked me at one point, tilting her head slightly. It caught me off guard. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her eyes told me she wasn't. I hesitated before answering. "Probably when I was 5, I admitted. I woke up and thought I saw a man standing at the foot of my bed. Just a shadow, really, but I swear it was there." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Did you close your eyes, or did you keep looking?" It was such a strange question, so specific, but something about the way she asked it made my stomach clench. "I kept looking," I said. "I had this feeling that if I closed my eyes, he would get closer." She smiled then, a slow, knowing smile. That was smart. That should have been my first clue that Sophie was different. We started dating a few weeks later. It wasn't one of those whirlwind romances. There was no rush, no dramatics. It was easy in a way I didn't expect. We just fit together, as if we had always known each other. She had this way of making things feel calm, even when they weren't. But there was something she did that bothered me. At first, it was just a small quirk, something I didn't think much about. Sophie never slept with the bedroom door closed. It wasn't a big deal. Some people liked airflow, others didn't like the feeling of being boxed in. I didn't question it. But it wasn't just that she preferred it open. She needed it open. I realized this the first time I stayed over at her apartment. It was a simple place, nothing remarkable. Small, cozy, a little old-fashioned. That night as I was getting into bed, I instinctively pushed the bedroom door shut. "Leave it open," Sophie said immediately. I glanced back at her. She wasn't looking at me, just at the door. Her voice had been calm but firm. "Wine?" I asked. "I just like it that way," she said. Too quickly. I shrugged it off, left the door slightly ajar, and didn't think about it again. At first. Weeks passed, and I started to notice patterns. Sophie never talked about it, never explained, but there were things she did that didn't feel normal. She always triple-checked the locks at night, not just the front door, all of them. The windows, the deadbolt, the chain. She would check, then check again, pausing for a second before finally stepping back. She always slept facing the door, no matter how we shifted during the night. Even when she moved in her sleep, she would always reposition herself, like she needed to see something before it saw her. And sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and find her lying completely still, eyes open, watching the hallway. One night, I whispered her name. She didn't respond right away. Then, without looking at me, she murmured, "Go back to sleep." There was something about her voice, something carefully neutral, like she was trying not to let something slip. That was the first night I started listening, and that was when I heard it. At first, it was just a feeling, an instinctive sense that something wasn't quite right. The air felt heavier, the silence too thick. But then, as I lay there, I swore I could hear it. Movement. It wasn't loud, not obvious, just a faint, deliberate shifting beyond the doorway, a slow creak of the floorboards, the softest rustling, like fabric brushing against the wall. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the old building settling. But every part of me knew better. And then Sophie exhaled, a deep, steady breath, like she had been holding it. That was when I knew. She heard it too. The next morning I asked her about it. I tried to sound casual, like I was joking. "Do you ever feel like, I don't know, like someone's outside the bedroom at night?" Sophie didn't laugh. She didn't even look at me. "You don't have to worry about it," she said. "It never comes in." Her words sent a sharp, sick feeling through my chest. "What never comes in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Sophie hesitated, then she shook her head. "Just don't close the door." She didn't say anything else after that. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the apartment. The usual noises were there, the occasional hum of the fridge, the distant sound of a car passing outside. And then, just after 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft shuffle, a single step, then nothing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, heart pounding against my ribs. But after what felt like forever, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak. Like someone shifting their weight? Standing just beyond the door. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Sophie in the dim light. She was awake, staring at the doorway. Her hand slid across the sheets and gripped mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We weren't alone. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Sophie. We just lay there, motionless, listening. Neither of us spoke, but her grip on my hand remained firm, almost too tight, like she was trying to keep me from moving. The noises eventually stopped, or at least I think they did. Maybe whoever or whatever was out there had left. Or maybe it was just standing there, waiting. The air in the room felt thick, heavy in a way I couldn't explain. At some point, the exhaustion won out and I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining through the curtains, the apartment looked normal, and Sophie was already up, standing by the bedroom door. It was wide open. She had never left it that open before. I pushed myself up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Did you open that?" My voice came out rough, groggy. Sophie didn't turn around. She was just staring into the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I think it got closer last night," she murmured. A cold sensation crawled down my spine. I threw the blankets off and joined her by the door, peering out into the empty hallway. "Sophie, what the hell is going on?" I demanded. She finally looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked scared. "I told you," she said quietly. "It never comes in, but I think it's trying to—" I felt my stomach turn. "But never comes in?" I asked again, this time sharper, more demanding. Sophie hesitated. Then she said something I wasn't ready for. "I don't know what it is." Her voice was calm, but the way her hands trembled slightly told me she was holding something back. "Sophie, please," I pressed. "Tell me the truth." She inhaled deeply, finally tearing her eyes away from the hallway. "It started when I was a kid," she admitted. "I don't know how, I don't know why, but every night I heard something outside my bedroom door, and every night I left the door open. Just a little." "Why?" I asked. She swallowed. "Because when I closed it, it knocked." The room felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls were pressing in. "You're saying this has been happening your whole life?" I asked, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. She nodded. "Every place I've ever lived, every apartment, every house, it's always there." A long silence stretched between us. I should have laughed, called her crazy, dismissed it, but I didn't, because I had heard it too. I knew she wasn't lying. "Do you just live with it?" I finally said. "Ration, I don't have a choice," she whispered. "It's never hurt me. It never tries to come inside. But when I close the door, it gets closer." A heavy weight settled in my chest. "So what happens if you lock the door?" I asked, dreading the answer. Sophie didn't speak for a long time. Then she turned and walked into the bathroom. "I don't want to talk about that." That night, I made a decision. I was going to lock the door. I didn't tell Sophie, she would have stopped me. But I had to know. I had to see for myself what would happen. When she fell asleep, I got up, walked to the door, and pushed it shut until I heard the click of the latch. Then, just for good measure, I locked it. I climbed back into bed, my body tense with anticipation. At first, nothing happened. The apartment was silent, just the usual distant hum of the city outside. I waited, my ears straining for the slightest sound. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I heard it. A soft, deliberate tap against the door. Just one. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Then, another knock. Soft, patient, like it knew I was awake. I turned my head toward Sophie, but she was still asleep. For a split second, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was the pipes or my own nerves playing tricks on me. Then the doorknob turned. Not violently, not forcefully, just testing. It twisted left, then right, like whoever was on the other side was checking if it was locked. I sat up slowly, my body rigid, every muscle frozen. Then the knock came again, louder this time. Sophie inhaled sharply in her sleep, like she felt it, like she knew. And then the whispering started. It wasn't loud, just a low, raspy murmur, like someone pressing their lips against the wood of the door, speaking directly into it. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I felt every hair on my body rise. The doorknob rattled again. The whispering continued. And then, the knocking turned into pounding. Loud, rhythmic, like something was furious. Like it knew I had broken the rule. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy, charged. Then, the worst sound yet, from the other side of the door. A deep, slow inhale, like something was smelling me. And then, in the lowest, gravelly voice I have ever heard, "I see you now." I lunged forward and unlocked the door. The second the latch clicked, the air in the room changed. The heaviness lifted, the silence returned. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to see. I lay back down, shaking, staring at the ceiling until morning. Sophie never asked me what happened. She didn't have to. She knew. And I never closed the door again. I didn't tell Sophie what had happened. I wanted to, but there was something about the way she looked at me in the morning, like she already knew. She didn't ask if I had locked the door. She didn't ask if I had heard anything. She just got up, checked the hallway like she always did, and went about her morning as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. I knew it, and she knew it too. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. The apartment felt different, not colder, not darker, just wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The air felt heavier, and there was a strange stillness at night, like the whole building was holding its breath. I found myself checking the door constantly, making sure it was still open just enough. 3 inches, never more, never less. I even caught myself triple-checking the locks the way Sophie did, my fingers twitching against the deadbolt like I was afraid I had done it wrong. And then I started seeing things. At first I told myself I was imagining it, just my brain playing tricks on me, trying to make sense of what happened that night. But then, one evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught something in the mirror. Not a reflection, not a shadow, something just outside the bathroom door, in the hallway. It was just a glimpse, a flicker of movement, too quick to focus on but too distinct to ignore. I turned sharply, my heart slamming against my ribs, but the hallway was empty. The bedroom door was open. 3 inches, perfectly in place. But for the first time, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The darkness in the hallway looked deeper than usual. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if the shadows were heavier, thicker, almost like they were pressing in. I stared for a long time, toothbrush still in my hand, my pulse thudding in my ears. My mind screamed at me to look away, to move, to do something. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring into the blackness, waiting for something to happen. And just when I started to convince myself that nothing was there, that it was all in my head, I saw it. A shape? Not fully formed, not solid, but a presence shifting in the dark. It was tall, unnaturally still, its edges blurred like smoke. It didn't move toward me. It didn't vanish. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the door and closed it. The moment the latch clicked into place, the bathroom light flickered. Once, twice. Then, soft, patient, right on the other side of the door. I stopped breathing. My hand hovered over the doorknob, fingers twitching, muscles frozen. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate, almost playful. Then, a whisper. It wasn't clear. Just a hushed, rasping murmur, the kind that tickles the edge of your hearing without letting you understand the words. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body rigid with terror, and did the only thing I could think of. I opened the door, and there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The bedroom door was open 3 inches, just like it had been before. The shadows were normal again, no longer thick and unnatural. The air was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it had. Something had been there. That night I didn't tell Sophie, not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of what she might say. afraid that she might tell me, "I told you so," afraid she might tell me something worse. Instead, I just lay beside her in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. It wasn't until the clock read 3:09 a.m. that I finally started to drift off. And then the door creaked. Not a knock this time, not whispering. Just the slow, steady sound of wood shifting, hinges groaning under weight. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes snapped open, my body paralyzed with dread. I turned my head toward the doorway. The door had opened wider. Not much, maybe an inch, but it was enough. And then I saw it. Not a person, not a shadow, a shape barely distinguishable from the darkness around it, standing just beyond the doorway, not moving, not breathing, just there. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even swallow. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but I knew I wasn't. It was watching. Sophie shifted beside me in her sleep. The moment she did, the shape moved. Not forward, not toward me. It moved back. Slowly it retreated into the hallway, vanishing into the shadows. And the door closed on its own. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't remember anything after that. But when I woke up, the door was open again. 3 inches, exactly as it should be. Sophie was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. She didn't say anything, just reached for my hand and squeezed it. And that was when I knew. It wasn't just her rule anymore. It was ours. For the next week, I lived in a state of heightened awareness. Every night, I checked the door. I never closed it fully, never tried to test it again. I listened, and every night I heard it. Soft movement, shifting in the hallway, the faintest creak of wood, the whisper of fabric against the walls. But it never entered. Until the night it did. I woke up to the feeling of something pressing against the mattress, not Sophie. Something else. The room was still dark, but I didn't need to see. I could feel it. A weight, low to the ground, pressing against the side of the bed. I turned my head, dread crawling through my veins. And in the darkness, inches from my face, I saw it. A him. Pale, stretched, fingers impossibly long, resting just at the edge of the blanket. Waiting. Sophie inhaled sharply beside me. She saw it too. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then, in the stillness, the fingers curled. I lunged for the lamp. The second the light filled the room, it was gone. Nothing. No hand, no presence. Just Sophie and I sitting there, staring at the empty space beside the bed. She reached for me, gripping my wrist so tightly it hurt. "We need to leave," she whispered. Her voice was flat, empty, terrified. Not. I didn't argue. We didn't pack. We didn't plan. We just left. Sophie grabbed her purse, I grabbed my keys, and within minutes we were in the car, pulling away from the apartment without looking back. The entire time, neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We both knew what we had seen. We both knew what had been in that room with us. I kept checking the rearview mirror as we drove, half expecting to see something in the backseat, something that shouldn't be there. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, even when we were miles from the apartment. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating, like whatever was in that room had followed us. We checked into a motel outside the city, a cheap, run-down place with flickering neon lights and a night clerk who barely looked up as we got our key. I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere else. The motel room was small and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, but the second I shut the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not total, not complete, but enough. The walls here felt solid. The air didn't feel wrong. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the fabric of her jeans so tightly her knuckles turned white. I sat beside her, unsure what to say, unsure what could be said. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "You saw it." It wasn't a question. I nodded. She exhaled shakily, rubbing her face with both hands. "I thought, maybe it was just me," she murmured. "It wasn't," I said. My voice came out flat, hollow. Another silence stretched between us. Then, quietly, she said, "I think it's always been there." The words sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers digging into her palms. "I think it follows people," she admitted. "I think it finds someone, watches them. But it doesn't show itself right away. It waits." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Waits for what?" She turned her head toward me, her eyes dark, unreadable. "For them to notice it." A sick, twisting sensation curled in my stomach. "Ah, impuster. It won't stop," she finished. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that wasn't possible, that things like this don't happen, but I knew it would be a lie. I had seen it. I had felt it. And now, it knew I had seen it too. I leaned forward, pressing my hands against my face, my mind racing. Then what do we do? Sophie was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, "We don't let it in." The words sent a chill through my entire body. "That's why you leave the door open," I murmured. She nodded. "Because once you close it, it knows you're afraid." I let the words settle, the weight of them pressing down on me like something tangible. We didn't go back to the apartment. Sophie called her landlord and broke the lease over the phone. We left everything behind, clothes, furniture, belongings. None of it mattered. We just left. We moved into a new place, a different city, somewhere with new walls, new doors, new locks. And for a while, things were quiet. But I never stopped listening. Every night I checked the bedroom door, never closed it all the way, never locked it. I always made sure to leave it just a little open. 3 inches. And every now and then, just past 3 a.m., I still wake up. Sometimes I don't know why. Sometimes it's just instinct. But every time, without fail, I look at the doorway. And sometimes I swear, I see something standing just beyond it, watching, waiting, and I know if I close the door, it will knock. So I never do, and I never will. I don't really know how to start this. I've told a few close friends, but every time I do, I feel like I sound crazy. But I swear this happened. For a while, I worked as a park ranger at a remote national park. I won't say which one because, well, if you've ever heard of the missing 411 cases, you'll understand why. Most of the job was boring, checking trails, making sure campers weren't doing anything stupid, responding to the occasional lost hiker. Pretty standard stuff. But the nights were different. The park had designated campgrounds, but there were always those hardcore hikers who wanted to venture deep into the backcountry. Those were the ones we worried about. Because sometimes they didn't come back. And sometimes they called for help. This happened in late September, right before the park started shutting down for the season. I was covering the overnight shift, monitoring the radio while my partner Dave was out on patrol. It was a quiet night, until the walkie crackled. Not the main radio, but my walkie-talkie. Now, that might not seem weird, but the only people who had access to our channel were park staff. And this voice? It wasn't anyone I knew. I grabbed the walkie, holding it to my ear. The transmission was full of static, but beneath it I could hear it. A man's voice. Low, panicked. "Help me." I sat up fast, my stomach twisting. "Hello? This is Park Ranger Lewis. Can you repeat that?" The signal was weak, garbled, like the voice was coming from far away. Then, clearer this time. "Help me, please. I'm lost. I don't know where I am." I grabbed the radio, flipping to the main frequency. "HQ, this is Lewis. I just got an SOS on my walkie. Do we have any hikers reported missing?" There was a pause, then static. Finally, the supervisor's voice came through. "Negative. No missing persons reports." I hesitated. If no one had been reported missing, who the hell was on our private channel? I switched back to the walkie. "Sir, can you tell me your name, your location?" Nothing. Just static. Then, deep breathing. Slow, labored, like whoever was on the other end was hurt. It's dark. I don't know where I am. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight, already heading for the ATV parked outside the ranger station. Okay, stay calm. Do you have any landmarks nearby? Anything you can see? For a long moment, silence. Then, or do I say you? I stopped cold. The walkie hissed with static, the signal warping, stretching, distorting. My heart hammered. I turned in a slow circle, flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing. Just the empty ranger station, the dark woods, the distant mountains. I swallowed hard, gripping the walkie tight. What do you mean, you see me? The static spiked. Then, laughter. Low. Breathless. Not a man's voice anymore. I dropped the walkie. It hit the dirt with a dull thud, the speaker still crackling, hissing like a thing alive. I backed up toward the ATV, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. Then, just before I reached it, the walkie went silent. Not static, not breathing, just dead air. Like whatever had been speaking had left. Or worse, it was never there to begin with. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I barely breathed. I sat in the ranger station with the doors locked, the radio clutched in my hand, waiting for the voice to come back. It never did. The next morning I told my supervisor. He just gave me a look. The kind that said, drop it. I did. For the rest of my time as a ranger, I never worked the night shift alone again. But the worst part? A week later, a hiker was reported missing. When they found his body, it was deep in the woods, miles from any trail. His radio was still clutched in his frozen hands. The Rangers never released the recording, but I know what they heard, because that night, when I was all alone in the dark, I heard it too. A week after the night I heard the voice on my walkie, the missing hiker's body was found. It was a search and rescue team that discovered him, about 12 miles from the nearest trail, way off any marked paths. He was face down in a dry creek bed, body twisted like he had fallen from somewhere high. His radio was still gripped in his stiff fingers, pressed tight against his mouth like he'd died calling for help. But here's the thing. His radio? It was on our private ranger frequency. The same one that no civilian should have access to. The same one I had heard that voice on the week before. The coroner ruled it exposure and a fall injury. Said he must have gotten lost, wandered too far, slipped and broken his leg before succumbing to the cold. A tragic accident. Case closed. Except it didn't make sense. The way his body was found. There were no tracks leading to or from him. Not his, not animals, not anyone's. Like he had just appeared there. I asked to hear the final transmission on his radio, but the higher-ups wouldn't release it. Classified evidence, they said, even to park staff. But one of the search team guys, someone I trusted, pulled me aside a few days later. His face was pale, hands shaking when he lit his cigarette. He looked me dead in the eye and said that radio was broadcasting. I swallowed. Broadcasting what? He hesitated, looking over his shoulder, then leaned in. Dead air. I frowned. What do you mean? He exhaled shakily. I mean, it was transmitting the whole time. When we found him, when we checked his radio. But there was nothing on the other end, no voice, no static, just this hollow, empty sound, like something was still listening. A chill ran down my spine. And Lewis, he continued, his voice dropped even lower. The battery was dead. I quit the job a month later. I don't go hiking anymore. And I don't ever keep a walkie-talkie in my house. Because sometimes when I'm lying in bed late at night, I swear I can still hear it. The low hum crackling static. And just beneath it, breathing. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where porch lights flicked on at dusk and kids played outside until their parents called them in for dinner. It was safe. At least, that's what we thought. We had a large backyard, separated from our neighbors by an old wooden fence. Beyond the fence was a dense stretch of trees, too small to be called a forest, but thick enough to feel isolated. As kids, my brother and I would dare each other to run into the woods at night, but we never made it more than a few steps before chickening out. Our house had a small back porch with a single bulb that cast just enough light to reach the edge of the yard. I never thought much about it, until the night I saw him. It was early autumn, I remember, because the leaves had just begun to turn and the air carried that crisp, earthy smell. I was 14 at the time, up late doing homework. My bedroom window overlooked the backyard, and out of habit, I glanced outside. That's when I saw movement near the fence. At first I thought it was an animal, a stray dog, or maybe a deer. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, my stomach tightened. Someone was standing just beyond the fence, deep in the shadows of the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt an icy wave of dread creep up my spine. The figure was tall, its body partially obscured by the branches. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details, but I knew I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a tree swaying in the breeze. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. There was a man standing in my backyard. I slowly backed away from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to take my eyes off him, afraid that if I looked away he'd suddenly be closer. I forced myself to turn and ran straight to my parents' room. My dad grumbled as I shook him awake, but the moment I told him someone was in the yard, he was out of bed in an instant. He grabbed a baseball bat he kept by the door and stormed onto the back porch, flicking on the light. The yard was empty. No footprints in the grass. No broken branches. Nothing. My parents assured me it was my imagination, that I had been staring at my homework too long, eyes playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. And that was only the beginning. The next few nights I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see that figure standing there again. And then, on the third night, I did. This time he was closer, standing just inside the yard. I could see him more clearly now. A tall, thin man, dressed in dark clothing. His face was turned slightly downward, as if he was staring at the ground. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. And then, he took a step forward. The movement snapped me out of my frozen state. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over my chair as I bolted for my parents' room. Again, my dad ran outside, but the man was gone. At this point, my parents were worried, but still skeptical. Maybe it was a neighbor passing through, maybe some teenager messing around. Then, a few nights later, something happened that made them believe me. It was around midnight. My mom had gotten up to get a glass of water. She happened to glance outside and saw the back porch light flicker on. She froze. The light was motion activated. Something had set it off. She nudged my dad awake and he crept toward the window. That's when they saw him. The man was standing at the base of the porch steps, not at the fence, not by the trees, right up against the house. My mom gasped. The sound must have carried because the man snapped his head upward, looking directly at the window. Then he bolted. My dad threw open the door, but the man had already disappeared into the trees. The police were called. They searched the yard, the woods, even went knocking on our neighbors' doors. No one had seen anything. But the worst part, the back gate was unlocked. We always kept it locked. Always. But that night, it had been unlatched from the inside, as if someone had been inside our yard. The police patrolled the area for a few days, but nothing turned up. And just like that, the man was gone. Or so we thought. Weeks passed. Then months. The weather turned colder, the days shorter, and little by little I started to feel safe again, until the morning we found the footprints. My dad was raking leaves when he noticed them. Deep impressions in the frost-covered grass, leading from the back fence all the way to my bedroom window. Not just once, over and over. Like someone had been coming back, night after night, standing outside my window, watching. That was the last straw. My parents installed cameras, replaced the fence, put in floodlights. The police were called again, but there were no suspects, no leads. Whoever he was careful. And just like that, the footprints stopped. We never saw the man again. Years passed. We moved away. My parents never liked talking about what happened, brushing it off as a drifter passing through. But I knew better. Because sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still feel it. That heavy, sinking dread, that unnerving certainty that someone is watching. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. Sure, I'd heard the rumors. The whispers about the Northwood dorms being haunted, about the missing student from 10 years ago, about the strange knocking sounds people claimed to hear late at night. But I figured every college had its share of urban legends. I had only been on campus for a month, settling into the routine of early classes, late-night study sessions, and cheap cafeteria food. My roommate Daniel was the opposite of me. Loud, outgoing, constantly surrounded by people. We got along well enough, though I often found myself retreating to the dorm when he went out partying. Northwood had an older, almost forgotten feel to it. The hallways were too quiet at night, the lights dimmer than they should have been, casting long, flickering shadows on the peeling walls. My dorm was on the 4th floor, one of the older wings that had barely been renovated. The room was small, the window overlooked the woods behind campus, and the radiator made strange ticking noises when the air got cold. It started with the door handle. One night, around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. The slow, deliberate turn of the knob. Not a rattle, not an accidental bump. Someone was trying to open the door. I sat up, my heart knocking against my ribs. "Daniel?" I called, but I knew he wasn't back yet. He had texted me an hour ago saying he was crashing at a friend's place. The knob stilled, but I could hear breathing on the other side, soft, measured, waiting. I reached for my phone, but as soon as my fingers brushed the screen, the sound stopped. I waited, frozen, listening. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself it was just someone drunk trying to find their room. It was a college dorm, after all. Stupid things happened. But then I noticed something. The peephole was covered. A shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't noticed before, but now that I looked, the tiny circle was completely blacked out, like something, or someone, was standing directly in front of it, watching. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Daniel came back, oblivious, hungover, laughing about something stupid his friends had done. I wanted to tell him, but somehow, saying it out loud made it too real. I convinced myself I was overreacting. Then, a few nights later, it happened again. This time I was awake, sitting at my desk, headphones in, drowning in an essay that was due the next morning. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and stale dorm room air when I heard it. Knob turning. I ripped my headphones off, my breath caught in my throat. I turned, staring at the door. It turned again, slow, testing. And then, from beneath the door, a shadow? Not just a shadow cast by the dim hallway lights. This one moved. It stretched, creeping inward as if something was pushing itself underneath the door, seeping like smoke into the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then a knock. 3 soft, deliberate taps. Not from the outside. From inside my closet. I sat there, frozen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I told myself it was my imagination, that my exhaustion was playing tricks on me, that I had misheard where the sound had come from, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. The knock had been inside the closet. Slow, intentional. My skin prickled with cold sweat as I forced myself to turn my head toward the door. The shadow beneath it was gone. The doorknob was still. The hallway outside was silent. But my closet door, slightly ajar, just enough for darkness to seep out, felt like it was breathing. I stared at it, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, but some part of me, the logical part, refused to move. This was a dorm. A normal dorm, in a normal college. There was no way someone had been inside my room. No way I hadn't noticed. And yet the air felt thick with something unseen. Something watching. I stood up, slow and deliberate, my chair making the faintest scrape against the floor. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Movement, breathing, the shift of weight in the dark. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the vending machine down the hall. My fingers clenched into fists. I wasn't going to let paranoia win. This was my room, my space. I wasn't about to start jumping at shadows. I forced myself forward, one step at a time, until I was standing right in front of the closet. My own reflection stared back at me from the cheap mirror attached to the door, wide-eyed, pale. I lifted a hand, hesitated, then grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the same cramped space filled with my jackets, a stack of shoeboxes, and the laundry I'd been too lazy to put away. My breath left me in a shaky exhale. Of course, there was nothing. There was never anything. I was exhausted, overworked, and psyching myself out over some stupid prank. I shut the closet, locked my dorm room for good measure, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up groggy, my limbs heavy with exhaustion. I went through my routine, barely thinking, my mind fogged over with the kind of fatigue that clings to you like a weight. I grabbed my bag and went to class, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The campus was buzzing with its usual energy, people rushing to lectures, half-asleep students clutching coffee cups like lifelines, the distant sound of someone blasting music from their dorm window. It felt normal. But then I saw the bulletin board near the student center, a cluster of flyers pinned to the cork. My stomach twisted as my eyes landed on one in particular. Missing person. The photo was of a student, a guy around my age. Short brown hair, glasses, a familiar grin frozen in time. My brain struggled to place where I had seen him before, and then it clicked. His dorm was down the hall from mine. I didn't know him well, had only seen him in passing, but a cold chill ran through me as I read the details. Missing for 5 days. Last seen leaving the dorm late at night. No sign of forced entry in his room. No leads. A creeping unease settled into my stomach. 5 days ago, that was around the time I had started hearing the sounds at my door. When I had first noticed the peephole was covered. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Colleges had thousands of students. People disappeared all the time. Ran away, dropped out, left without telling anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that it was connected. That night I double-locked my door. I shoved my desk chair under the handle, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. It made me feel stupid, but I didn't care. Sleep came in restless waves, every creak of the old building sending a spike of anxiety through me. At some point, deep into the night, I woke up to breathing. Not mine, not Daniel's, right outside my door. Slow, shallow, like someone standing just inches away, listening. I stayed completely still, my heart racing so violently I thought it might shake the bed frame. My phone was under my pillow and I barely dared to move as I reached for it, my fingers shaking as I turned on the screen. 3:12 a.m. A single notification glowed at the top. Motion detected at your door. I stared at it, my mouth dry. The security app linked to the dorm's hallway cameras had picked something up. My hands fumbled as I tapped it open, my breath caught in my throat. The screen flickered, the grainy camera footage loading. My dorm door was in frame, the dim hallway stretching out in both directions. For a moment, it showed nothing. Then movement. Someone was standing right in front of my door. Not knocking, not trying the handle, just standing there. And then, they bent down. I watched paralyzed as the figures slowly lowered themselves until they were eye level with the keyhole. Watching. My stomach turned to ice. They knew I was awake, and they were waiting for me to move. A cold sensation spread through my chest, like my body knew something was deeply wrong before my mind could fully process it. I gripped my phone tighter, barely breathing as I watched the screen. The figure outside my door remained crouched, completely still, just inches away from the peephole. I couldn't make out their face, only a vague silhouette in the dim hallway light. They weren't knocking, they weren't moving, just waiting. A part of me wanted to call out, to ask who it was, to break the silence. But another, much stronger instinct screamed at me to stay quiet. Whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. They wanted to watch. The realization sent a deep electric dread through my limbs. I stayed frozen, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial on my phone. If I called someone, Would they hear? Would they try to get in? And then they reached up. Slowly, deliberately, their hand lifted toward the peephole. I watched through the grainy footage, my pulse hammering against my ribs, as their fingers pressed against the tiny glass circle. Covering it, the screen went black. I sucked in a sharp breath. They knew. They knew I was watching. For a long moment, nothing happened. The hallway camera remained dark, my dorm eerily silent except for the soft hum of the old radiator. I didn't move. My skin felt too tight, my body stiff with anticipation, waiting for the next sound, the next shift in the air. But it never came. After what felt like hours, I tapped the app again, refreshing the feed. When the camera flickered back to life, the hallway was empty, no sign of anyone. The peephole was clear. But something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been outside wasn't gone, that they were still nearby, listening. The air in my dorm suddenly felt heavier, the walls closing in, the silence too sharp. I had to check. I had to know. Heart pounding, I slipped out of bed and moved toward the door as quietly as I could, my bare feet making no sound against the cold floor. My hands were damp with sweat as I reached for the knob, pressing my ear against the wood, straining to hear anything beyond it. I inhaled deeply, bracing myself. Then, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. Just the dull hum of the exit sign at the far end, the distant murmur of someone's TV behind a closed door. Nothing unusual. Except for one thing. A small, folded piece of paper lay on the ground right outside my room. I stared at it, my skin crawling with unease. It hadn't been there before. Slowly, I crouched and picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. There was only one sentence scrawled across the page in uneven handwriting. I like watching you sleep. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My fingers gripped the paper so tightly it crumpled in my palm. Someone had been inside the dorm building, standing at my door, watching me. Maybe for days. I slammed the door shut, locked it, then shoved my desk chair under the handle again. My breaths were coming too fast, my mind racing through every possibility. Every time I had dismissed the strange noises, the shifts in the air, the creeping sense of being watched. This wasn't in my head, it wasn't some prank. Someone was fixated on me, and they were getting closer. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind against the window made my skin prickle with paranoia. I kept the dorm lights on, my back pressed against the wall, watching the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. No more knocks, no more notes. Just an unbearable silence stretching through the early hours of the morning. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to move. My limbs ached from tension, my thoughts clouded with exhaustion, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to do something. By the time I made it to campus security, my hands were still shaking. I showed them the note, explained the knocking, the covered peephole, the motion alert from my phone. The officer behind the desk listened with a concerned expression, nodding as I spoke. But when I finished, his response made my stomach twist. "We'll look into it," he said. "But there's not much we can do unless an actual crime was committed." I felt my breath catch. "What do you mean?" "Someone was outside my room in the middle of the night. They left this." I held up the crumpled paper, but he only sighed. Look, dorms have hundreds of students. Pranks happen all the time. And unless we have footage of someone breaking in, it's not really a police matter." I stared at him, my pulse drumming in my ears. "So that's it? You're just going to ignore this?" "We'll increase patrols in your building," he offered. "If anything else happens, let us know." I wanted to scream. Instead, I grabbed the note and walked out. For the rest of the day, I tried to go about things normally, but everything felt off. I couldn't focus in class. I kept scanning the lecture hall, searching for any familiar face from the footage. Was it someone I knew? Had they been watching me all along? When I returned to my dorm that evening, my hands were slick with sweat as I unlocked the door. I braced myself for something, another note, a new sign that they'd been back. But the room was exactly as I had left it. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. I sat on the bed, my mind churning. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it was worse, stronger. And then my phone buzzed. A new motion alert. I swallowed hard, my fingers hesitating before tapping the notification. The camera feed loaded, flickering slightly, and when it cleared, I stopped breathing. The hallway was empty, but the door to my dorm was slightly open. My entire body locked up. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. A single realization took hold, icy and paralyzing. They weren't outside anymore. They were already inside. I didn't move, didn't blink. My breath barely passed my lips as my gaze flicked toward the closet door. Just like before, it was slightly ajar. The air in the room felt suffocating, pressing down on me from all angles. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my hands barely able to keep steady. 901, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but before a sound could leave my throat, the closet door creaked open. The line went dead. The next thing I remember is running, sprinting down the hall, pushing past anyone in my way, my only thought getting out. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the cold glow of the streetlights. The police arrived within minutes. They searched my dorm, questioned my neighbors, even checked security footage. But in the end, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no figure on the cameras, no fingerprints but my own. They suggested I might have imagined it, that I had left my door unlocked and the wind had pushed it open, but I knew better. I didn't go back. That same night, I packed my things and stayed with a friend off campus. The next morning, I put in a request for a room transfer. A week later, I moved to another dorm in a different building. For a while, nothing happened. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe now. But sometimes, late at night, I would wake up with the same suffocating feeling. The sensation that someone was there, just beyond my line of sight, standing in the shadows, waiting. And a few weeks later, when I was scrolling through my phone, trying to clear out my old notifications, I saw it. An unread message. No name, no number. Just a single text sent the night I fled my dorm. You were right to run.